Joe Foss was 26 years old, already had a college degree, and already had 100 hours of flight time logged on his own dime, when the United States Marine Corps looked at his paperwork and decided he was simply too old to be a fighter pilot. Within about a year of that rejection, he'd shot down 26 enemy aircraft over a single island, tied the all-time American record set in the First World War, and become the most famous fighter pilot in the entire country, without ever finding out about it, because nobody bothered telling him while it was happening. He'd go on, after the war, to become a state governor, help create the modern Super Bowl, and get detained by his own country's airport security over the Medal of Honor hanging around his neck. Everything that follows is drawn from the National W.W. Museum, the Congressional Medal of Honor Society, contemporary news coverage, and multiple corroborating military histories. Joseph Jacob Foss was born in April 1915, near Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the oldest son of Frank and Mary Foss. Raised in an unelectrified farmhouse on land his family worked themselves, alongside a younger brother and sister. His father, by all accounts, had lived an almost unbelievable life before settling down to farm, traveling for a time with the Ringling Circus, working as a railroad conductor, surviving several early aviation crashes, and building a local reputation as an essentially unbeatable catch wrestler and boxer at county fairs and traveling carnivals, the kind of local legend status that made an ordinary farm life feel considerably less ordinary to a young son piecing the stories together. Frank Foss's own fascination with flying rubbed off on his son early. At 12, Joe attended an air show featuring Charles Lindbergh, the aviator who'd just become the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic. A few years later, father and son took their first flight together in an old aircraft with a local South Dakota pilot, and Joe was hooked completely, his entire sense of what he wanted out of life crystallizing around getting into a cockpit himself someday. In 1933, when Joe was 18, his father was killed instantly by a downed power line while trying to get his stalled car moving again during a violent thunderstorm, electrocuted the moment he stepped out to investigate. Joe, suddenly the man of the household, took over running the family farm and worked multiple jobs simultaneously to keep the family afloat, still managing to finish high school in the process, despite the sudden weight of responsibility landing on him all at once. By 1936, Joe had earned enough to pay off the family farm's mortgage outright, and with his younger brother old enough to manage it going forward, he finally went to college himself, a 21-year-old freshman, surrounded by classmates several years younger, working as a campus janitor to cover tuition and spending every spare dollar on flying lessons rather than anything resembling ordinary college social life. He graduated from the University of South Dakota with a degree in business administration, a pilot's certification, and roughly 100 hours of flight time, having also served in the South Dakota National Guard along the way to round out his preparation for whatever came next. In June 1940, with war clearly coming and conscription looming, Foss hitchhiked some 300 miles to Minneapolis with $5 in his pocket to enlist in the Marine Corps Reserve specifically, reasoning correctly that the Marines would see combat before other branches got the call. He was accepted into the Naval Aviation Cadet Program, earned his wings at NAS Pensacola on March 31, 1941, and was commissioned a second lieutenant. Despite his flying experience, at 26, he was again told he was too old for a fighter squadron assignment, and was instead assigned to a photo reconnaissance unit, a technical, demanding job he threw himself into anyway, training with camera equipment 16 hours a day to graduate at the top of his class, rather than sulk about not getting the assignment he actually wanted. Refusing to let go of his goal, Foss talked his way into the Navy's own carrier landing qualification program on the side, despite the program's flat initial refusal to train a Marine officer alongside its own aviators, eventually striking a deal to cover the base's unwanted funeral duty detail in exchange for a training slot nobody else wanted to give up their own time for. A trade that, to a man who'd already been working multiple jobs simultaneously since his teenage years, barely registered as an inconvenience at all. He graduated, set the course gunnery record in the process, and finally, at 27 years old, got what he'd been chasing since he was a teenager, watching his father come home with stories. Real command experience, as executive officer of Marine Fighting Squadron 121, headed for the Pacific Theater at last. VMF 121 arrived at Guadalcanal's Henderson Field on October 9, 1942, relieving a squadron that had already been fighting there for months and was more than ready to leave the island behind. The island had only recently been taken from Japanese forces, and Japan wanted it back badly. Henderson Field was strategically vital enough to shape the entire direction of the Pacific War, sitting at the point where Japanese expansion toward Australia and American efforts to hold the line met head-on, and both sides knew exactly what was at stake in holding it. 4 days later, on October 13th, Foss flew his first combat mission, dove on a formation of Japanese Zeros and shot one down, only to find 3 more of them immediately on his own tail. His aircraft took serious damage in the resulting fight, losing engine power entirely. Foss lined up on the runway and rode the dying plane in at full speed, rather than slow down and offer his pursuers an easier shot, skidding past the airstrip entirely and crashing into a stand of palm trees at the end of it. Ground crews who examined the wreck afterward counted more than 250 bullet holes in the airframe. Foss walked out essentially unhurt. What followed was one of the most sustained individual combat performances of the entire Pacific War. Flying an F-4F Wildcat that was, by every technical measure, inferior in speed and maneuverability to the Japanese Zero it regularly faced, Foss and the pilots under him, who adopted the nickname Foss's Flying Circus, shot down enemy aircraft at a startling pace through October and into November, even as nightly Japanese naval bombardments and daily air raids pounded Henderson Field into a cratered mess. Marine ground crews grew so desperate for spare parts and fuel that they routinely stripped downed aircraft scattered around the island just to keep a handful of Wildcats airworthy at any given time. On October 25th alone, following an all-night naval bombardment that Foss later said lit up the airfield like broad daylight, and with Henderson's runway so cratered that 2 of his own pilots crashed simply trying to take off, Foss personally shot down 5 Japanese aircraft in a single day, becoming the first Marine ace to do so in a single engagement. Foss also developed his own tactical refinements as the weeks wore on, adapting on the fly rather than relying purely on raw nerve. Recognizing that the Wildcat's standard 6 machine guns burned through ammunition faster than he actually needed against a single target, he had 2 of them physically removed from his own aircraft to extend how long he could sustain fire across multiple enemy planes per sortie, trading raw firepower for staying power in a fight. On at least one occasion, after exhausting his ammunition entirely while defending an American resupply convoy from an incoming Japanese strike, Foss simply climbed to high altitude and circled the ships as though he were a scout for a much larger incoming American formation, a bluff that convinced the attacking Japanese force the convoy was a trap, causing them to abort and turn back without dropping a single bomb on ships he had no actual way left to defend. On November 7th, while chasing down a straggling reconnaissance plane far from the rest of his formation, Foss got separated from his squadron entirely, ran into a violent rain squall that stalled his engine mid-flight, and was forced to ditch his Wildcat in open ocean, with no real hope of gliding back to land. Unable to swim, tangled briefly in his own cockpit as his inflating life vest tried to pull him upward while his foot remained caught. Foss nearly drowned, before finally breaking free and surfacing. He spent hours alone in the water, in an area known to have sharks, with nothing but a small emergency kit and his own fading hope of rescue, before a Catholic missionary stationed on a nearby Solomon Islands outpost happened to spot the crash and convinced local islanders to paddle out by canoe and search for him. Foss spent roughly 5 days recovering on that island afterward, staying in the local chief's own hut and eating fresh food unlike anything he'd grown up with on a South Dakota farm, before a Navy flying boat finally located the outpost and retrieved him back to Henderson Field. By the time malaria finally forced him out of combat that winter, Foss had personally shot down 23 Japanese aircraft between October 9th and November 19th, 1942. A run of aerial victories condensed into barely 6 weeks of fighting. Returning to combat on January 15, 1943, he shot down 3 more in a single engagement immediately upon arrival back at the front, bringing his total to 26 confirmed kills, tying the all-time American record set by Eddie Rickenbacker during the First World War, and making Foss, at the time, America's leading ace of the entire Second World War, a title that came with no shortage of newspaper attention he had absolutely no part in seeking out. Over roughly 3 months of combat, Foss's squadron as a whole was credited with 72 Japanese aircraft destroyed, meaning his own personal total accounted for more than a third of everything his entire unit managed to shoot down. Foss genuinely had no idea, throughout most of this, that he'd become a national celebrity back home. Life magazine put him on its cover that June, calling him America's #1 ace, while he was still simply trying to keep his younger pilots alive on a battered jungle airstrip, entirely unaware his name and photograph were circulating in newspapers thousands of miles away. He returned to the United States in March 1943, and on May 18, 1943, received the Medal of Honor personally from President Franklin Roosevelt at the White House, a ceremony he later said felt considerably stranger and more uncomfortable than anything he'd experienced in actual combat over Guadalcanal. Rather than settle into a comfortable war bond tour permanently, Foss pushed to get back into the fight, and in February 1944, returned to the Pacific Commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 115, this time flying the newer, more capable Corsair fighter. By this stage of the war, Japanese air power in the theater had been badly depleted by nearly a year and a half of sustained American pressure, and Foss's second tour consisted mostly of ground attack and search and destroy missions, rather than the kind of large-scale aerial combat that had made him famous the first time around. He never added to his kill total during this second deployment, and the all-time record he'd tied would eventually be broken later that year by Major Richard Bong, flying the far more advanced P-38 Lightning in an entirely different theater of operations. 8 months into that second tour, a second, far more severe bout of malaria struck Foss, dropping his weight from around 180 pounds to roughly 115 pounds and nearly killing him outright, forcing him home for good this time, and the war in the Pacific ended before he ever fully recovered his health. What Foss did with the rest of his life reads less like a single biography than an entire anthology of separate, fully lived careers. He started a crop-dusting business with a fellow veteran, work that suited a man who'd spent his entire adult life outdoors and in the air, and it grew successful enough to fund a local car dealership as well, once the two partners had money to spare. He served in the South Dakota state legislature in the late 1940s and early 1950s, helped organize the South Dakota Air National Guard from the ground up, and eventually rose to brigadier general within it, and in 1954 was elected governor of South Dakota at just 39 years old, at the time the youngest governor in the state's history, serving 2 full terms through 1959. Personal hardship ran alongside all of that public success. His wife, June, dealt with serious diabetes-related health issues for years. His first daughter was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. A later son survived a serious bout of polio during Foss's second term as governor, at a time when the disease still genuinely terrified American parents. Rather than simply endure it privately, Foss went on to help found a children's hospital in Sioux Falls, specifically to address exactly the kind of medical challenges his own family had faced, and later served as national president of what was then called the Society for Crippled Children and Adults, turning personal misfortune into an organized effort to help other families going through the same thing. Leaving the governor's office in 1959, Foss became the first commissioner of the fledgling American Football League, serving until 1966, and helping shepherd the young, financially shaky league through its early competition with the far more established NFL, a rivalry that eventually produced the AFL-NFL World Championship game, which the public quickly started calling, and which officially became the Super Bowl. Around the same period, Foss became a familiar television face hosting the popular outdoors program The American Sportsman for ABC, bringing hunting and fishing expeditions from around the world into American living rooms for years. Decades later, in 1988, he was elected to 2 consecutive one-year terms as president of the National Rifle Association, capping off a public career that had already touched professional sports, state politics, broadcast television, and military aviation history, all in a single lifetime. Joe Foss died on January 1, 2003, at 87 years old, following a stroke. He was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, the same cemetery, as it happens, his flight out of Phoenix the year before had ultimately been bound for. Fighter ace, Medal of Honor recipient, 2-term governor, founding commissioner of a professional football league, television host, hospital founder, and NRA president. By any reasonable measure, one of the fullest single American lives of the entire 20th century, built almost entirely on a farm kid's flat refusal to accept "too old" as a final answer, over and over again, across 6 straight decades of trying anyway. Foss made one final round of national headlines in January 2002, at 86 years old, while flying out of Phoenix to speak at a National Rifle Association event and address cadets at West Point. Wearing his Medal of Honor around his neck, as he often did at events precisely because he wanted people to see it and ask about it, and carrying a pacemaker that meant he couldn't pass through a standard metal detector, Foss was pulled aside for a manual pat-down search instead. Security personnel, operating under newly tightened rules only months removed from the September 11th attacks, found the medal itself along with a small Medal of Honor branded nail file and a novelty dummy bullet keychain tucked in his jacket pocket, and treated all 3 items as a potential weapons risk. Foss was held for roughly 45 minutes, made to remove his cowboy boots 3 separate times, along with his belt and necktie, while the medal itself was passed from one uncertain supervisor to the next, none of them apparently recognizing what it actually was. Accounts differ slightly on whether the medal was ultimately allowed through security with him or had to be mailed home separately afterward, but the underlying confusion around it was never in dispute. Foss, characteristically unbothered by the personal indignity of the whole ordeal, said afterward that he hadn't been upset on his own account at all, only that airport staff hadn't recognized what the Medal of Honor actually represented, and by extension, the men who never made it home to receive one of their own. It became a minor national story anyway, cited for years afterward as a case study in exactly how disorienting the sudden overcorrection in post-9/11 airport security procedures could get.